The BBC's 1997 redesign was a seismic moment in marketing, design, and communication. In one fell swoop, a sprawling ecosystem of bespoke logos was transformed. Minimalism had triumphed, and the BBC master brand had become unified and extraordinarily powerful. However, by 2001, the constraints that made this modular system so effective had begun to loosen. One by one, logos across the corporation were tweaked in both subtle and dramatic ways. This is the story of what happened after the BBC's dramatic 1997 rebrand, and why a rebrand of the same scale was necessary by the early 2020s. It's hard to overstate just how dramatic the BBC's 1997 rebrand, led by Martin Lambie-Nairn, was. Before this rebrand, the BBC's branding across the corporation was inconsistent. News programs lacked unified BBC News branding. National and local radio stations used abstract numerals and illustrations that overshadowed the BBC radio brand. And bespoke logos were everywhere, from the club to the stationery closet. The BBC's corporate diagonal logo used too many colours and was illegible at smaller sizes. Text looked uncomfortable next to its skewed shape, and the different colours, treatments, and scales that appeared in with other logos splintered whatever authority it had. Cut to 1997. When all you needed to see were the BBC squares to know exactly what you were about to watch, hear, or read. The restraint of the logo and the strict rules around how it would appear gave it gravitas. It didn't animate onto the screen, it faded on, or was simply already there. It was never in colour, always in black and white. There were no stroked or textured features. It was flat, usually without any effects, and it was quiet, dignified, and carried immense power. But by 2001, the BBC's utilitarian oasis of logos had some outliers. Controllers of BBC TV channels insisted on individual logos, and national radio stations demanded the same. A once monochrome universe started welcoming purples, reds, and yellows. The typography was no longer just Gill Sans, with new types introduced for 5 Live and BBC 3. Individual brand identities began to be fleshed out for the BBC website. Local radio stations introduced uniform logo conventions in 2008 that didn't use the BBC radio logo. Brands adapted their identities to fit into squares for apps and social avatars. And new channels, platforms, and programs kept adding to the complexity. While the core conventions of the BBC 97 rebrand were still visible, by the early 2020s their limitations had been exploited. Stark utilitarianism had been compromised as almost every sub-brand sought to stand out against a world of competitors, both external and internal. This left the BBC's suite of logos in need of a cleanup to prepare it for the next digital age. An early signal that change was afoot was the introduction of the BBC's first proprietary typeface, BBC Reith. Designed by type foundry Dalton Marg, it was introduced in 2018 to lower costs, as multiple typefaces, including Gill Sans, Helvetica, and Futura, were being used. It also addressed legibility issues and allowed content to be branded beyond adding a logo when it appeared on other platforms. Starting with services like BBC Sport, and eventually appearing in the logos of BBC News, BBC Radio, and on the BBC website. Then in October 2022, the BBC unveiled a corporation-wide rebrand, updating all logos with the BBC Reith font. Most notably, the BBC logo was updated with the in-house typeface, the characters were also scaled down, and the gaps between the boxes were increased, slightly. The collaboration between the BBC's in-house design team and agency Wolff Olins is highly reminiscent of Lambie-Nairn's 1997 rebrand. In fact, when comparing the updated logo system to the 1997 one, it's clear that the core values are the same. There's a high use of restraint, with mostly monochrome logos and consistent layouts. And both systems rely heavily on their respective typefaces to communicate the brand. This explains why it was vital for the BBC to develop its own proprietary font. Gill Sans was as much a part of the BBC brand as the blocks, but ultimately, it didn't own it. Additionally, revelations about the designer, Eric Gill, sexually abusing his daughters and conducting sexual experiments with a dog had circulated since the 1980s, making it a poor association to have reputationally. Plus, the Gill Sans font wasn't practical anymore. In an age of web-safe and system fonts, it wasn't fit for purpose. What made the font so elegant was also its weakness in the digital age. In this video, the designer for BBC News talks about the Gill Sans Q and how much space the Descender requires compared to BBC Reith. But the 2022 rebrand departs from the 97 one in some key ways. Firstly, there's selective use of colour. All the radio networks maintain numerals in coloured circles, but now use Reith. The blocks are also alive and morph into icons for other services. There's news, represented by red speech bubble-like blocks, iPlayer, with the blocks forming a play button, and sounds, which admittedly looks exactly like a BBC logo concept presented in the satire show W1A. While the 1997 rebrand treated the BBC logos as untouchable elements that were almost static, each logo in this rebrand is built to be interacted with. While still utilitarian and modular, the behaviour of these logos makes them feel playful and accessible. And more than that, the logos form part of a broader system in a more sophisticated way than the 97 ones did. Take the main broadcast TV channels, BBC One, 2, 3, and 4. All essentially have the same logo, much as they did in 1997. And much like 1997, it's left to the idents and the content to communicate the character of each channel. But each channel has its own colour. And with icons made out of blocks and a typeface it owns, the corporation's logo doesn't have to be present for you to know that these services come from the BBC. While the response to the BBC's 2022 rebrand was predictably cynical, it mirrored the response to the BBC's 1997 rebrand. Yet while the 97 rebrand was seen as a pivotal step forward to media and broadcasting branding globally, the 2022 one may not carry the same legacy. This is because it built on the foundations laid by Lambie-Nairn. Although there were new challenges for the brand to confront, the 2022 rebrand seems more like a sequel than a whole new series. However, this is where the BBC in-house design team and Wolff Olins deserve some credit. The 1997 rebrand was designed, as Martin Lambie-Nairn alluded to be the last rebrand the BBC would ever need. That 1997 logo was elegant, functional, and seemingly untouchable. But in the internet age, it had its problems. It had legibility issues at small sizes. The squares were very close together, the scale of the lettering was quite big, and the letters were also quite thin. The logo didn't animate very well, and attempts to bring it to life never felt quite right. The list of issues is kind of similar to the ones Lambie-Nairn was dealing with in 1997. Logos don't stay the same forever. You want to respect them, but you can't revere them. And the longer they're untouched, the more untouchable they seem. Now, I'm not arguing that this rebrand is exciting or truly inspiring, but in a way that's expected of a public broadcaster, it's practical. And in a way that Lambie-Nairn demonstrated, it could be justified by referring to cost savings. They no longer have to license Gill Sans. And functionality. It's more legible, more interactive, and a better fit for the digital age. They've built around the logo by unbundling its elements and creating an entire design system from them. And they've set the brand up for another 20 years of inevitable tweaks. It's ironic, seeing how companies like Apple and Google brand themselves today, Lambie-Nairn's stark, utilitarian 97 logo system would fit in perfectly. Yes, the logos would have had to be stacked to fit into avatars and app icons, but those are easy adjustments. Yet brands don't stay dormant for long. Each contributor wants to feel their fingerprints on their work, and often that means tinkering with the brand. While the BBC's ecosystem of logos pre-2022 was a bit of a mess, it was nowhere near as bad as the early 90s. Thanks to the foundations that Lambie-Nairn laid, brands could introduce new elements and still maintain their BBC DNA. Now, time will tell how many tweaks the 2022 system can handle before the next rebrand is necessary.